there's a lot of magical thinking that goes into, particularly like sort of the prosperity gospel of evangelicalism that I was
Mm.
attached to, which effectively says if you're doing it right, it's easy, it's fun, life will be such a joy. God will bless you 10,000 fold for everything that you do if you are living according to his word. And if your life is in any way, if your relationship is in any way imperfect, there's all of this shame. There's this notion that it's your fault, that you're doing a bad job, when in reality, relationships are just hard.
Christy, thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie. I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been familiar with you through YouTube, but I don't believe I've ever gotten the chance to actually engage with you before. I'm most familiar with you through Talk Heathen. You're one of
Mm-hmm.
the hosts, one of the main hosts from what I can tell. But enough for me. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, no, excited to do this. I'm a gender and sexuality therapist, or at least about 6 years ago, that's the path that I was looking to be on. And I was approached by the atheist community of Austin because they wanted to do a show about gender and sexuality.
It's
And so
awesome.
we did secular sexuality for about 5 years. That wrapped back in March. And when that ended, they did sort of bring me on to Talk Heathen. I'd done a handful of episodes and some different things, just kind of all across the atheist community of Austin family of networks. And yeah, it's been heartbreaking in a way because I miss secular sexuality. I was very proud of what we put together on that
Yeah,
show.
I
Uh,
bet.
but it's been nice having the production schedule where you just show up. You don't have
Yes.
to worry about booking guests or having
Yes.
interview questions already set or memorizing somebody's career information. You can just sit down and take phone calls.
Yes, that oh man, I can't even imagine. That must be so nice. As the person who does, I always communicate with the audience as we, but it's just me, guys. It's literally I'm
Sure.
the editor, I'm the poster. Well, that's really cool. And 5 years in YouTube, that's like 30 years
Right?
in
Yeah.
videos. That's such a long time. And how did you get involved in like the atheist space in terms of were you raised religious and then kind of deconstructed, or have you always just been secular atheistic?
Yeah, no, I was very dyed in the wool. I
Wow.
grew up in a family that, at least initially, or when I was young, we were sort of that Christmas and Easter type of Methodist. And then when I was in maybe middle school, my stepdad started to take things a lot more seriously.
Why do
Uh,
you think that is? Why do you think he
you
randomly
know, he to this day has some very like conspiracy theory type mindsets. And I think it was just the latest thing for him to get sort of sucked into. I know it's still a big part
interesting?
of his life. Or at least I understand it to be. We haven't spoken in about 7 years now. So that's part of the story. I'm sure people can sort of guess how you get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
But a lot of drama in between, to be honest with you, where things started to get very house churchy, praying in tongues, falling under the Holy Spirit, casting out demons sort of way.
Yes.
Uh, and
Yeah.
when I got to college, I guess mainstreamed a little bit and then just further and further pulled away, and eventually got to the point where I was willing to say to myself, I'm pretty sure there's not a God. But I sat on that for a solid year. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my partner or anybody in my life for a solid year. And then when I did finally come out to somebody, I made her sit on it for a year till she got drunk and told my best friend. And then things started to kind of snowball from there.
I feel like the best or the worst kept secrets are always kept until a drunken night, and then somebody tells
Yeah,
somebody,
yeah,
"Rip
yeah.
that
There's
Band-Aid
truth
off."
in the wine.
Yeah, yeah, but that's so interesting. And so at the time when you guys kind of went from Creasters, I think they used to call us the
Sure.
Christmas Easter folks, to more like heavily indoctrinated, did any of that work for you, or were you just doing it to keep the peace in the house? Did you believe any of that newer stuff?
Not in a direct, I mean, yes and no. Like I definitely was uncomfortable. And the fact that my mom was very uncomfortable and sort of pushed back against some of these things. And
Yeah.
for a while, it was my stepdad was going to church and my mom was going to a separate church, and I was kind of pulled between the two. At that age, who I went with was in many ways dictated by like what time my favorite Sunday morning cartoons were on. So, it was a mixed bag, but I definitely did start to buy in. And it's worth pointing out that I was sort of beset on all sides. It was
Interesting.
both like my stepdad with this very strong evangelical message, my mom with this much more casual God is love sort of Methodist ideals. But I was also going to a private Christian school, and
Interesting.
yeah, as I got
So
to
many layers
high school,
there.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it was hard to escape, and on some level, it was good to have this, like, well-balanced diet so that I could compare and contrast and have sort of judgments around those things and recognize that some of this has to be made up because not everybody can be right. But for me, once I got to high school, things really went south in my life in a lot of ways. Like my family was just under an incredible amount of stress. My older brother was in a car accident, was in a brain injury
Wow.
rehab.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
I
rough.
I had a tough time in junior high the way a lot of people do. I was bullied in a lot of ways. I Now looking back, it's like, oh yeah, the queer autistic kid was gonna get bullied in school. That wasn't that wasn't me. That was just what happens.
Did not stand a chance.
Yeah.
Just right out of the gate, did not stand a chance. That's so interesting. And so what was it between high school and college that made you say to yourself, like, I don't know that any of this is real, as opposed to just like a watered down forever Creaster version?
Yeah, I mean, I in high school got really passionate about it all. It was what the cool kids were doing. All of
Yes.
my friends were in bands, which eventually meant that all of my friends had to be in worship bands, and so that
Yes.
that kind of became the thing, right? Like I couldn't play
Yes.
an instrument, but I was hauling gear and hanging out barefoot at the church on Wednesday nights, and like being just really into having a group of friends that like sort of obligated to be nice to me and like let me hang out with them.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Man, I feel like I feel like that is maybe it's uniquely Southern, but I feel like that is the American Christian experience is there's like a moment in high school where you become like a new wave evangelical because you really want to hang out with all the kids wearing sandals and puka shell necklaces and playing
right?
guitar. You know what I mean? And then but you feel like you're the only one going, I'm not having that much fun. I just don't have any other friends. Like
Yeah.
this is just like I don't have any place else to be, but I would probably be there. I don't know. I feel like I'm the only one not feeling this. Interesting.
Yeah, I feel like there was an episode of King of the Hill with the whole like skateboarding, cool youth pastor kind of
Yes.
thing, and
Yes.
I definitely was dogmatic about it. I'm That's very much my personality. Like if I'm going to do something, I tend to really get focused on it. I tend to really throw myself into it. I don't like to waste my time in a certain way. So if
Yep.
you're telling me that there is an all-powerful master of the universe who wants me to do X, Y, and Z, by God, I'm gonna show up and I'm gonna do that shit.
Yes. Yes. 100%. I feel like there's always that time where we're like, I'm going to be the best Christian. I'm going to be the best
Mhm.
one. I'm going to do whatever I got to do. I'm going to be the best one. And then here we are talking about atheism and
Yeah.
making it our whole brand. Um, so did that have anything to do with why you decided to go into your field, or was that something you were interested in before you began deconstructing? Because you're in such a
Yeah.
niche field.
Yeah, so I wanted to be a therapist, I think honestly, even in high school,
Yeah,
if for no other reason than because I needed somebody to talk to, and I wanted to be a part of that solution.
that's
Uh,
awesome.
and I flirted with the possibility of quote unquote Christian counseling. I can rant about that later if we need to, but even then, I knew. okay, you can be a counselor who is a Christian.
Right.
Christian counseling is bullshit. To any of your audience who doesn't know, Christian counseling is
Bullshit.
bullshit.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, 100%. Huge difference, kind of like in I do stand-up, and being a
mm.
Christian comedian and a comedian who is a Christian,
Oh
2
yeah,
totally,
jeez.
totally different things. Totally different things. That's interesting, though. I'm glad you didn't go the Christian counseling route,
Yeah.
the fake counseling route. Um, and so what kind of turned your attention towards the, like, gender, sexuality, queer identity aspect of was that also from personal
Yeah.
experience, kind of?
I honestly have never come up with a good answer for like why I was drawn to that, even in high school. I mean, maybe the simple answer is that I just felt fascinated and confused by gender and by sexuality and these different things. I mean, I got married as a 21-year-old conservative Christian virgin. So the fact
What?
that I was obsessed with the idea of sex while I was in my undergraduate, probably stems from not having any idea what the hell it was and
Yes.
wanting to know.
Yes.
Uh,
That's wild. That is such
yeah.
a wild detail. Wow.
So I was definitely dedicated. I was very passionate about my faith, and I wanted to understand human sexuality. And I realized pretty quickly that if I was going to work with relationships, I mean, I think maybe the sexuality piece came from being fascinated with love, being fascinated
Mm,
with relationships, always being a hopeless romantic, and wanting to be a couples counselor, which eventually turned into wanting to be like a sexuality counselor. And in pursuing all of that, I started to notice, even in my undergraduate, even as a like pretty passionate Christian, that I was afraid I was going to end up in the role of having to sort of wag my finger at queer kids and tell them that they
yeah.
were wrong and try to convert them or fix them. And I didn't understand it in detail, but I was definitely uncomfortable with all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Obergefell happened when I was in graduate school. So while I was in my undergrad, that was all the war on marriage rhetoric and all of these efforts, SB 8 in California, and all of these efforts to enshrine marriage in the Constitution as one man and one woman. And I was just very uncomfortable with that debate. I don't think I recognized the queerness in myself or really what that meant, but I did know that from like junior high on, everybody in my life made certain assumptions about me being gay or having these ideas about who I was, and just being not right in a lot of different lenses.
Wow.
And I don't know that I was even thinking about myself in that sort of like conscious, direct way, but I knew that the
Right.
notion of having to fix queer kids terrified me. And so
Yeah.
I steered
Yeah.
clear of Christian counseling. Tried to
Good.
understand all of those things. And the more I got into it, the more I understood psychology, the further away from my, parents' version of the church, and the more I met people from work and, went from this town. I grew up in a town with, when we first moved there, I was in kindergarten. We had one stoplight. When I was in high school, we got our second stoplight, but we turned it off
Yeah.
at 10 p.m. to save electricity. So by the time I left, it was still a very small school. Even though College Station, Texas is not exactly a booming metropolis, it's a hell of a lot bigger than what I was used to. And I was suddenly
Yeah.
meeting people who were different and
Yeah,
had
it's a
different
pretty
points of
liberal
view.
area, isn't it? It's pretty, like, liberal, if
As
I
college
remember
towns
correctly.
go, it's pretty conservative, especially when you
Really?
compare it to where I am here in Austin. That
Oh,
school
yeah.
67 miles up the road. But it, I I don't know if you are or your audience is at all familiar with the podcast. I'm from Driftwood.
No.
I'm not from Driftwood, but I grew up in the shitty town 20 minutes away from Driftwood, which is just a tough place to grow up,
I bet.
being queer in any kind of way. So I was
I
finally
bet.
meeting people that I could relate to, and a lot of these things started to fall off. And eventually, my wife at the time and I started to admit that we did not hold to these things. And that as we pulled on that thread, we started to realize, well, being 16 and virgins was kind of what drew us together. Now that we're like 25 and we don't believe in any of this shit, we don't have a whole lot in common anymore. And so I went on something of a sexual revolution. And during that period, I was going to every possible opportunity I had to be at a conference or be at a trivia night or whatever that had to do with sexuality. And
Interesting.
through that, the ACA heard about me and they wanted to do a show on gender and sexuality, and that's kind of what brought me from somebody who was struggling with and then eventually deconstructed from, but was kind of numb to and staying away from my former faith. That turned me into somebody who wanted to be an activist, who wanted to
That's
work with religious
awesome.
trauma with my clients and really find meaningful healing in this space.
That's awesome. And my next question was going to be, how do you navigate coming to terms with your own sexuality when you're already in the epitome of a cis marriage, just like a
Right.
straight
Yeah.
Christian marriage? Are you guys still married?
No, we split up back when I was in my late 20s, and we did actually deconstruct a lot of things together.
That's
We
awesome.
started to date polyamorously and had some pretty wild adventures, and it was that process of dating other people and deconstructing the few things we had in common that made us realize, like, maybe we don't actually belong together in a meaningful
Yeah,
way.
that's
So
awesome. That's
yeah,
good for you both, though, I think. I hope.
I
Yeah.
certainly believe so. It was, a difficult process to give up, my faith, my friends. I mean, we dated from high school all the way on. So all of our
Wow.
friends' relationships were kind of intermingled. And it was
Yeah.
a really big process. But I guess at this point, about 8 years out from that experience
Wow.
and, put it all back together.
Yeah, and I think a very common misconception that people have about atheists is that the day that we decide we don't believe in God, we're out here being like, "Yeah, freedom. I can just do whatever I
Yeah.
want. I can, debauchery and I don't have any morals." And
Sex, drugs,
really,
rock and roll.
yeah, and really there is a mourning process. There is
Hmm.
a heavy mourning process. And then there's usually an angry process
Yeah, I
where
hear that.
we're like, who can I even trust? Like, who can I even trust? All of you were lying to me. Who, like, you're all liars. Like, you've all just been making fun of me. Um, and I just wish that more people understood that I've never seen anybody come out of the Christianity closet just like, woo, like party, party, party. It's
Right.
always just heavy and traumatic, and it usually takes a long time, and most of the time years before people can even put words to it, and usually it's not the a word, it's anything else they can use other
Sure.
than that
Yeah.
word. Um and so through your counseling, I noticed on your profile that it talked a little bit about like kink and poly counseling as well.
Mhm.
Is that Do you find that a lot of that is because people are rooted in shame from religious upbringings or just society in general? Because I feel like we live in a pretty Christian society, especially in Texas. Where do you think that comes from, where people seek out those services?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely tell people whenever I have a consultation, I take a point of mentioning that I have always had a passion around relationships. I've always been fascinated by the different ways that people love each other and connect, and in particular, trying to support people who our culture doesn't do a great job of understanding. And then I always kind of follow that up with something along the lines of, after a couple of months, I mean, not even years, but just a couple of months of doing that work, I started to realize that most of the people I was interacting with were dealing with some level of religious trauma, whether because they, like myself, grew up in a really fundamentalist environment, or if they just sort of exist as one of those marginalized identities in this
Yeah.
water that we're all swimming in.
Yeah, yeah, I'll never forget the most guilt I've ever felt was when I had made out with a guy in college, still a virgin, like still, but I was home for Christmas and I was thinking like everyone in this room would think I was so disgusting if they
Mm,
knew that I made out with that guy. Like clothes stayed on, didn't even come off.
yeah,
And I just think all the time about the number of people who exist out there. And I came from a pretty in comparison to the people I talk to, a pretty liberal religious background.
sure.
Um, and I can't even imagine how many people lived that way or still living that way to this day, all because somebody somewhere in a pulpit was like, that's the devil, until you get married. And then suddenly that's not the devil anymore. It's perfectly okay. We just expect you to be ready to go the day
Right.
you get married.
Fun, easy. You don't need an instruction manual. God will show you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like, "Oh, please, that's the one area you need an instruction manual and lube and help and probably watch some videos." Um, do you find that a large majority of your clients come from a religious background in general, or just in specific areas that you work with?
It's interesting. I occasionally do have people who specifically seek me out because of religious trauma, and that was the thing they were looking to heal, and I seem like just the guy to help. But more often than not, it is, well, I'm feeling anxious. I'm struggling with depression. It's these like fundamental components of life, and then they'll sort of sneak in. And yeah, I saw that you do religious trauma work, and I don't know, maybe that could be helpful for me. And then 3 weeks down the road, that's all we can really talk about.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I recognize how that happens and why that happens, but people are, I think, uncomfortable acknowledging religious trauma as significant in their lives. I mean, even just as a field in the counseling profession, we are constantly helping people recognize some of their magical thinking, some of their cognitive biases, and helping people to sort of break free of irrationality. But as a field, there's almost always a asterisk or some sort of apology for religious beliefs, some
Yes.
sort of excuse where those things are, for lack of a better word, like they're sacred cows that we're not allowed to really push back against.
Yeah.
And I don't want to give people the wrong impression. Like, I do work with folks who maintain a religious point of view, and I don't use my counseling office to be to evangelize for atheism or anything
Yeah.
silly like that.
Yeah.
But there is so much about our culture and even the like medical profession that prevents us from really calling religion what it is.
Yes, yes, and I also think, partially from personal experience, partially from just having spoken to people through episodes of this podcast, I think in order to admit you have religious trauma, people think that means you have to insult your parents or your family, you have to
Mm,
say they did something wrong, or the other end is people are very embarrassed by how long once they've deconverted, they're so embarrassed by how long they were involved.
sure.
Like I had a guest who deconstructed when he was 45, and he was just all he could talk about was how embarrassed he was that he didn't see what he sees now for 40 years,
Hmm.
not realizing that some people I've had other guests who 60 years in, he was
Right.
married for 40 years before he figured it out. And so I wonder if that's part of it too, is once people figure it out, they just can't believe when they look back how long they believed it. So they would just rather not bring it up than have to admit to themselves that they in their terms wasted so much time in that lifestyle.
Yeah, well, and it's also, I think, in sort of a emergent property of religious trauma itself.
Mm,
Obviously, when we talk about religious trauma, that's a broad umbrella that can cover
so
a great
broad.
number of things. But to me, the significant ingredient that would maybe apply the word religious at the top rather than some other form of trauma is the social component.
Yes.
Because if something humiliating happens to us, something terrifying, something upsetting happens to us, we recognize that this is bad, this is
Yes.
wrong. And even if it hurts, we're able to call it what it is and
Right.
label it as painful. And that allows us to heal, that allows us to do something about it. When it comes to religious trauma, one of the most difficult components is that this bad thing happened. And then everybody in my life stood there and either did nothing or blamed me for it or encouraged me to just sort of take my lumps and keep moving. And everybody really co-signs that experience. So even something that would
Absolutely.
be relatively minor in a different context, because everybody told you that you deserved it or that it was right and just, that lingers for a long, long time. And when we start to sort of shake free of some of those things, it's really necessary for somebody to come alongside us and be like, no, no, that's fucked up. It's okay to
Yeah.
be upset about that.
Yes, yes, and the first few people who do that, those are the people they warned you about in church.
Right.
So it
Yeah,
might even
exactly.
take more people. And the interesting thing about religious trauma is that it can come from so many different directions. Like in my house with my mom, I was never told any of the stuff that traumatizes you. I was never told any of the sexist stuff. I was never told any of that. But in church, in Sunday school,
Mm,
away from my home, that's where I was told those things. That's where all it takes is one little kid being like, "Oh, your mom lets you do that? Well, my mom told me God doesn't like that." And you're
yeah.
just like, "Oh." I remember, I was playing with a little girl, and I was probably in kindergarten, and I said, If you could be anyone, who would you be? If you could be anyone in the world, even like a Disney character." And she said, "I wouldn't be anyone else because God made me who I am, and you shouldn't wanna be anyone else either." Right, right, and I was like,
Bitch!
"We weren't even at church, we were just at my house," and I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, oh, I guess I'm just awful for wanting to be Pocahontas." Like,
My
that's just
icebreaker games are evil.
yeah, yeah, just little things like that. So even if I know a lot of people, it comes from their household and their parents, but even if your home seems relatively normal, all it takes is those people at church being like, "Oh, it's interesting that you are wearing that now. That's new." And you're just
Mm,
like, "Oh, I can tell that's bad. What does that mean?" You know? Um, and it's just so interesting. And so for you personally, was there any area of your deconstruction process that was the toughest to get through?
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think for me, the part that honestly still lingers and that I still really struggle with, and maybe this is a little bit of my like ASD shining through, but I was really married, really attached to the idea that God had a perfect plan for everybody, for
Yeah.
everything. It wasn't just, at least in my experience where I was growing up, what I was learning, it wasn't just, oh, here are 10 rules that God wants you to follow. It was, you are meant to be constantly in prayer with God, and He will let you know what breakfast to eat, what clothes to wear. There was this notion that God had a perfect plan for my life, and every single movement or motion ought to be headed in that particular direction. And anything short of that was me being some number of standard deviations outside of God's plan. And now there's still this sort of lingering idea of, well, this doesn't feel good, so it must be wrong. I must be doing it incorrectly. I must be,
Yes.
bad in some way. Otherwise, why
Yeah.
would I be experiencing suffering and pain? Because that comes
Yeah.
from stepping out from under God's will.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a man, that's such a powerful thing when they're like, "We're not gonna tell you what the plan is. You don't know what the plan is. We don't know what the plan is. God knows what the plan is. He's not gonna tell you what it is,
Yeah.
but you need to figure it out." And you're like,
Yeah.
yeah," and it's very much like you said, "This doesn't feel good, so I'm guessing it's not part of the plan. Oh, wait, but I forgot it's not supposed to be easy either, so
Yeah.
maybe this is and then you're just confused. Everybody's just confused. Like, of course, that would be just astronomically confusing. And then there's also I don't know if you still have this or not, but there's always like, I have been an open atheist, like, atheism has been my whole brand for years now. And there's still that little microcosm in the back of my brain that's like, "Yeah, but what if?" Like,
Right?
what if? Like, I mean, what if this is what if you
Mhm.
literally he gave you a manual. What if he literally gave you a manual and you just did your own thing anyway? And that's scary. Like the rapture, I don't know if you had rapture fear as
Oh,
a
yeah.
kid,
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, the rapture is like that's still a fear. And I don't believe it's ever gonna happen. And I'm still very much like I still
Just
check under
keeps
my
not
bed.
happening.
Yeah, it just keeps on happening. There's a guy down the street though who swears it's gonna happen for like 3 years. He's sworn it's gonna happen like every week, I think. Um, do you do you find that there's a common pattern, in terms of what people need to hear or what they ask about or what tends to make them feel better or make their process easier, whether they're guests of yours or whether they're just people that you know? Have you ever noticed any patterns in terms of this seems to be a common theme among people that have trauma or just need to deconstruct or need to see a counselor?
Yeah, a lot of it is kind of what we touched on, this idea that what happened to me was okay, or there's no reason for me to complain about it. Why am I being such a big baby about some of this stuff? Or, a mindset along those lines. And then outside of that, everybody's story is going to be unique, but a really common theme is a sense of isolation.
Mm,
Of I'm supposed to be in this world, but not of it. So I am disconnected from everybody in my life who I view as secular. And then I'm going to be further disconnected from the people in my life who are in the church, but are on the wrong side of some of these things. And then honestly, the people who are really excelling, who are amazing Christians, who are doing such a good job and must be God's favorites, well, now I feel really isolated from them as well. And
yeah.
everybody just keeps telling me, go pray to God, go pray to God. And he's not really answering. So that makes me feel isolated too. I
Yes.
think a lot of people experience just loneliness in that sense.
100%. I was talking to somebody, I'm trying to remember who it was. I was talking to somebody recently about how a lot of times I think loneliness in men and relationship issues in women, and this is just me guessing, I am not a
Mhm.
mental health professional. I've always wondered if a lot of like daddy issues, quote unquote, in women stem from the first dad they were ever told who loved them and never showed up and never spoke to them, and that's God. I've always
Yeah.
wanted to see like an extensive study in the number of people who grew up Christian, the number of women, and also end up in lonely or isolating or abusive relationships because we're taught from day one that the person who loves you the most, the man who loves you the most, will never speak to you. He'll never make his presence known. He'll never be in the same room as you. You have to put in all the effort with that relationship. You have to do all the work. And then people are surprised when we grow up and we're in these relationships where we're doing 100% of the work and the guy's not doing anything. And they're like, oh, it must be
Mm-hmm.
daddy issues. And you're like, the
Yeah.
the wrong it is daddy issues. You're not wrong, but I don't think we agree on which daddy that comes from. And I've always wondered if, because I know there's like a loneliness epidemic in men, or at least they're talking about it more. And I've always thought there might be a connection there somehow
Yeah.
between people who are raised religious and people who men who suffer from loneliness and women who just can't seem to get into relationships that are equal partnerships.
No, I definitely see that. And I think that there's a lot of magical thinking that goes into, particularly like sort of the prosperity gospel of evangelicalism that I was
Mm,
attached to, which effectively says if you're doing it right, it's easy, it's fun, life will be such a joy. God will bless you 10,000 fold for everything that you do if you are living according to his word. And if your life is in any way, if your relationship is in any way imperfect, there's all of this shame. There's this notion that it's your fault, that you're doing a bad job, when in reality, relationships are just hard.
yeah.
Like they
Yeah.
involve pain. Life
Yeah.
involves pain. There's suffering that exists as a human being. None of that has anything to do with your identity or your
Right.
Christ likeness.
Right. Right. And there's also like that fair balance. It's like, at what point is it too hard? Right? At what point are you like, okay, now I'm suffering, like in this, I should be in a different relationship. It's like it's hard to determine how difficult a relationship should be for somebody versus unhealthy versus too easy, because that's unhealthy as well. Um, through your practice or through secular sexuality, did you ever come to any realizations about yourself where you're like, oh shit, through maybe talking to somebody else
Oh
or
god,
researching
yeah.
something?
All the every day. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, you have to be mindful not to overly project back and forth. But I will absolutely say that one of the great benefits of my job is I will, for instance, work with a couple and they'll be bickering back and forth. And one of them will finally say, I probably shouldn't have X, Y, or Z. And I'll think to myself, well, shit. I XY'd and Z just last night. Do I
Yeah.
need to apologize for that? You
Yeah.
know, there's a lot of that, and particularly working with neurodivergent folks, I think that
Mm,
that sort of helped me to recognize some of my own diagnosis concerns, and working with queer folks really opened my eyes to some of my own identity pieces. So it's it's a really beautiful job in that sense because you
I
get
bet.
to really stare at people. You know, people invite you in to really look at their vulnerable places. And as you get some understanding of that, you begin to not have magical powers about how the world works, but to start thinking about relationships and behavior and some of these emotional things that can be easy to overlook.
Yeah, yeah, that's wild. Just like seeing yourself in what you're hearing about, and you're like, do I owe an apology? This is
Yeah.
confusing. Wait a second. I didn't come here to be attacked.
Right?
um, um, when you were first kind of discovering your queer identity, was it kind of a slow rollout? Was there a moment where you were like, okay, I this is me now? How did that
Mm.
go for you?
Yeah, it's so strange. And I think that if I had grown up in an environment where I was allowed to be anything other than cis het, uh, things would have been a lot easier. I
Yeah,
honestly also think that if anybody had had a meaningful conversation with me about neurodivergence, that that would have been incredibly helpful because my whole life, I mean, as a kid, all of my friends just, it was an out secret that there was something weird about me.
yeah,
And I didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it was, but we were all picking up the same vibe. Everybody had a sense that there's something just incorrect. And, you know, for years I fought against that and I tried really hard to mask or to normalize. And then at a certain point, it was like, well, fucking fine. None of this is working. So you throw it all away. And I think I don't want to say I overdid it by any means, because I don't regret that phase of my life at all. But there was a spell where I was really, really exploring everything and wearing all of the different hats and trying on all the things when in reality, I identify as queer. I'm definitely a part of the queer community. And I think I'm mostly just autistic. Like I'm mostly straight.
yeah,
I'm mostly cis. You know, I definitely don't fit into these perfect boxes, but I'm not gay. And for the longest time, that stressed me the hell out because
yeah,
I was only told the options were gay or correct. And I knew I wasn't correct. But girls are pretty. So,
yeah.
you know, it was very scary to find women attractive and not know what to do with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and for somebody who's listening and they may be like, "Wait a second. What does that mean for someone? What does that mean for you personally to be a member of the queer community but not be gay?"
Yeah, you know, I would just say that the queer community is a really large umbrella when it's at its best, and that we don't need to sit down and talk about who suffers most or have these
Right.
suffering Olympics or these different things. The
Right.
truth is, if anybody has ever told you that your gender, your presentation, your sexuality is wrong or incorrect in some way, then, you know, you're welcome to join. Like, I think that you belong here.
Yeah.
Maybe in some future world where we can, you know, give people blood tests and then tell them, oh, you're 95% straight or
Yeah.
whatever else. Like some of these things, some of these communities won't be as amorphous and nebulous, but we're talking about humans. And so
Right.
I think it's always going to be squishy. It's always
Oh,
going to be
yeah.
messy. And there's no value in gatekeeping. There's no
Right.
value in keeping people to the side. You know, if you are somebody who is like me, who is in a monogamous marriage to a very conventionally attractive hubba hubba woman, uh, I try not to be at the front of the parade. I try not to be stealing the microphone. You know, I
Right.
recognize that even as I do activism and we're having this conversation, that
Mhm.
I am this like cis het white guy in many, many respects.
Right.
But I'm also not going to pretend that these aren't valid and important parts of who I am too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think also most people can relate to, or many people can relate to, that first crush they ever had on a same-sex person, whether
Uh-huh.
it was in kindergarten or college. I think we've all experienced that feeling where we're just like, we love that person or we have a crush on that person. And like we can tell that the way that we're responding to them versus other people is different. Like they're not my best friend. I am attracted to this person, but I'm not attracted to that gender. Like I have a crush on this person, but I don't necessarily, like for me, example,
That's
maybe I
really
have a
hard to sort through. Like,
right,
why is this friend, like,
right.
so much friendlier to me?
Right, right, and why do I feel the same way about this person that I feel about boyfriends, but this isn't a boyfriend? Like, I think it's such a fluid, what sort like, spectrum, I guess,
Yeah.
that I can absolutely see how people would just be really confused to try and figure out where they belong, and I also think there's a pressure to figure out where you belong,
Right. Yeah.
especially when we're young, no matter what the identity is, there's that pressure to, like,
Are
"Are
you a
you gay?"
goth or a burnout, or, like, which
Yeah.
club do you belong to?
Yes, yes, which label are you, and then, you get into your 30s and you're like, "I am tired and I am many things. I
Yeah.
don't know. I can explain, I can sit here, I am exhausted."
Well, whatever
Um,
you wanna call it. I don't
yeah.
even that's why queer is just my favorite,
Yes.
word in the world. But yeah, if I may,
Yes.
one of my first, like, same-sex attraction crushes was actually my therapist, and I think that
Interesting.
yeah, I mean, to be really clear, he did absolutely nothing to
Oh, yeah.
encourage that. There was nothing that
Right.
ever happened or would be
Right.
inappropriate.
Right.
But I honestly think that that was why I was able to have a crush on him, because I knew
Interesting.
he wouldn't act on it. I knew
Right.
that it was safe for me to have those feelings without worrying about, like, well, but what if he kisses me and I don't like it? Or it was really empowering to be able to have those feelings and not immediately feel obligated to, like, stomp them out in some way.
Yes. Yes, that's such an interesting perspective. This idea that I think people do that with doctors and therapists. I think people do that
Mm.
with television characters
Oh,
because
yeah.
they're safe, like Gil Grissom from CSI. I don't have to worry about him coming to, take me on a date or something like that. That's a very interesting observation. And I also feel like maybe when people feel immense feelings like that, maybe for the first time, they don't know what to do with it and they
Mm,
don't
mhm.
realize that one of the options is to just not do anything with it. You don't have to act on it. You don't have to label it if you don't want to. You don't have to tell everybody you know if you don't want to. Um, so I
Yeah.
wonder if that's part of it. As somebody who's never necessarily felt any kind of confusion on sexuality beyond, like a crush here and there, I've always wondered what that must be like for people. Do they feel like they need to pick a team? Do they feel
Mm.
like or do they need that team in order to feel like they belong somewhere? It's like where does that do they need the club to feel like they're not alone or do they need the label because they're afraid one day they're going to be confronted and asked, "What is your label?" and they're going to need to know what it is. Um,
Yeah.
I
Well, I
don't
mean,
know.
so much of my religious experience was about, like, listening to the Holy Spirit and, like, letting
Yes.
God guide me in that way, such that your emotions become sort of synonymous with your actions.
Yes.
And the idea that you are allowed to have a thought, a feeling, a fear, a fantasy that is not something you have to be held responsible for. It's not something you have to,
Right.
like, take captive in any way, that
Yes.
you're allowed to just, oh, that was a weird dream. Don't know what to make of that. Like, you're allowed to do that, and
Yeah.
I don't think I got that message. I think I really believed that my dreams were messages from God, if anything, you know?
Yes. Yeah. I feel like so much of at least American Christianity is all on you. It's all
Mm,
on you. You don't pray enough. You need to pray more. Your relationship with God, you this, you that. So when they say, masturbating is a sin, and then the next thing you know, you have a dream about a random teacher or stranger or something, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to hell. Like, I'm going,
yeah,
no, you just
seriously.
have a brain that functions all the time, 24/7. Like, none of us are going to know why you thought about your math teacher in that dream. That doesn't mean anything. You're not going to hell. But it's sad that so many biological functions are
Mm,
blamed on
mhm.
people, especially for neurodivergent people. It's like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's weird about me, guys. I'm with you. I'm weird. Something's different. Meanwhile, if somebody had just said, like, oh, this is Christy. Christy's autistic. Say hi to Christy. Hi, Christy.
Yeah,
It would have been a
cool.
non-issue. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. I also would love to see a study done someday on the age of people who began deconstructing and their neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
I think many of us caught on very early that we were so much different than everybody else, and we thought it was because there was something wrong with our brain, when really I wonder if that divergence made us aware of, I don't wanna say the grift, but, like,
Sure.
the,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? Like, because I
We
was,
start questioning things, we start demanding answers, we
yeah.
want people to actually follow the rules and be
Yes.
consistent.
Yes, 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 because I feel like I've had severe ADHD my whole life, and I was always that kid who was getting in trouble for asking questions in church, and I, up until even college age, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 30. Um, I remember, like, I would just ask questions, legitimate questions, but because it was that whole intrusive thought that won't go away until I say it out loud thing,
Mhm.
that, like, the last time I got in trouble was the college ministry. They separated the men from the women,
Right,
of
no,
course,
of course,
as you do. And, this girl who got married at 19, therefore she had, she had
she's an expert because
she's
she's
an
the only person
expert.
in the room who's actually admitting to having sex.
Yes, like, she's an expert on marriage, even though it's been, like, 6 months. She's telling us about how women shouldn't preach. Women's job was to sit at the feet of their husbands. He's the head of the household. He should lead the family in spirituality. And I raised my hand and I was like, "What's the difference between what you're doing and preaching?" I was genuinely curious. I had also been on the debate team for a long time, so that was probably part of the problem. And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "Well, you're sitting in a chair at the front of the room. There's like 20 of us here. We're listening to you tell us about the Bible." I genuinely wanted to know. I wasn't trying to be sassy. I was like, "Okay, clearly she's doing something. I must be confused because clearly something's going on here that's not preaching." And she just like looked at me and I just got up and left because I knew that, like, I had said something wrong. She was just like, I don't even remember if she said, "We'll talk about that later," or I think I blacked out and I think she blacked out at the same time because, like, we both had, like, a moment, and I just remember leaving.
Could've
I
been
just
such a
left that day.
great mic drop opportunity too.
Yes, yes, and but I think the worst part about it was that I legitimately didn't mean it. Like, I just,
Mhm.
I wasn't trying to be sassy, like, boom, I was just, "Yeah, oh, okay, so we're doing something different here. Oh, okay, what's this that we're doing if it's not preaching?" Newsflash, it's preaching. But I wonder if people like that, who we've been encouraged to be curious our whole life, in school, "Be curious, be curious, be curious," and then in church, it's like, "Don't be curious, turn that off,
Right.
stop." I wonder if those are the people that deconstruct the fastest because we're like, well, I'm not going to spend another 15 years of nobody answering these questions. I'm just not going to come to church
Mhm.
anymore. Um, and then everybody else catches up like 10 years later. I don't know. I would just be interested to see numbers on that. I don't even know how you would get that kind of data, but it would be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, no question. I definitely think that neurodivergent folks are maybe overrepresented in the atheist sphere,
Yes, ma'am.
and that is fascinating to me. I think you
Yes.
see the same thing when you start looking at the kink community and the poly
Yes.
community, and
Yep.
there's a reason for that. If you are willing to deconstruct society's rules, you're gonna start attracting a particular type of person.
Yes. Yes. I think there's a group of people who say these are the rules and we do the rules. And then there's people who say these are the rules. Everyone needs to follow them. Let me dive deep to find out why wait, this doesn't make any sense.
Right? Yeah.
Guys, these rules don't make any sense. Guys, the rules, they don't make any sense. And like, we will
Wait,
not
but you
shut up.
said we were gonna follow them,
Yeah.
so I'm just
Yeah.
looking for some clarification here?
Yeah, exactly. With like the equivalent of the adult version of like, didn't we have homework?
Yeah,
Didn't
right?
you? Yeah. So interesting. If somebody was listening to this and they maybe are deconstructing religiously, or maybe they're trying to figure out where they sit in terms of who they are as a person, their sexuality, they're just really confused across the board. What would you say to somebody like that who just doesn't even know where to begin in terms of figuring out who they are?
Yeah, I guess I would start with don't panic. There's no
Don't
need to
panic.
have this stuff figured out right now. I think that people, especially when they start to commit to, okay, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to read a book. They start to feel like they are broken and in urgent need of being fixed. And I would just suggest to you that whether you are the happiest, healthiest, most well adjusted person on the planet, or you feel like your life is an absolute walking disaster, that's just another way to be. You're just human. And
Yeah.
I might hope for you to find some wellness, to find some peace, to find some stability, but you don't owe it to anybody, not even yourself, honestly. You have the
Yeah.
right to be as much of a mess as you want to be. You're not broken. You're just different. And if you would like to be differenter or different in another way, then great. Go heal. Go find yourself a great therapist. I don't want to dismiss that at all. I mean, that's what I do for a living. But I just my heart breaks when I see people feeling like they're behind, that
Yeah.
everybody else has already figured it out and they're somehow the mistake. And well, why didn't I deconstruct when I was, 30 instead of 40? Why didn't I deconstruct when I was 20 instead of 30 or whatever else? Like, you are where you are and who you are is fine. And if you would
Yeah.
like to be different, great, go be different.
Yeah, go be different with people who appreciate you for being different.
Mhm.
'Cause I thought that was, like, the saddest part of your story was being a little kid and knowing you're different. I bet you were actually fun. I bet you were actually a lot of fun. Like, looking back, I'm like, "Dang," like, so many kids were so fun who we were told were, like, weird and different or
Mm,
something like that,
mhm.
and I bet they're still fun today. I bet they're still really fun people, you hope. Well, Christy, this has been an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed sitting down with you. Was there anything else you wanted to plug or to lead people towards? Anything coming up for you or any place we can see your work?
Yeah, I'll be on Atheist Experience in mid-January, or I'm sorry, in mid-December. So I think right around when this airs.
Yep.
Continuing to be on Talk Heathen, and I suppose cross your fingers. We're looking at trying to maybe retool or revamp some version of secular sexuality.
Awesome.
Other than that, please feel free to find me online if you're looking for great resources on religious trauma or anything in that direction. But yeah, that's really everything from me. I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and talk with you.